please join me in welcoming Professor Löwy.
Well, I am very honored to be invited to this symposium in honor of our friend Fredric Jameson. Merci beaucoup. My paper, I've changed slightly the title of the paper. Now it's called Revolutionary Nostalgia, the Romantic Anti-Capitalist Moment in Fredric Jameson's Cultural Criticism. Okay. There is a surrealist game called Carte d'Analogie, where a person is analogically compared to an animal, a tree, a precious stone, etc. If you are interested, I have the rules of the game here. Comparing Fredric Jameson's thought with a precious stone, the image which comes immediately to my mind is that of a diamond. Why? For two reasons. First, I think he has the shape, the structure, the form, and the intensity of a diamond for two reasons. First, the many-sidedness, yes, the multiplicity of facets of his thought, each one shining its own light. And second, more important, because of several hard and sharp cutting edges. You know, diamond is a very hard cutting stone. Of these cutting edges, there is one which I would like to emphasize, and it is anti-capitalism. Anti-capitalism. Of course, it is a dialectical anti-capitalism, acknowledging, as Marx in the Manifesto, that capitalism is at the same time the best and the worst thing which happened to humanity. I'm, of course, quoting a phrase from Fredric Jameson's well-known article on postmodernism as published in New Left Review, yes, 1984. So, dialectical. But let us dwell for the moment, in my first part, on the negative instance, that means, and particularly on its romantic dimension. Because I think there is a romantic anti-capitalist moment, in the dialectical meaning of moment, in Fredric Jameson's Kulturkritik. Yes? Okay. Now, what do I mean by Romanticism? Yes? Most Romanticism scholarship is based on the apparently obvious assumption that we are dealing with a literary movement of the 19th century, right? I think this assumption is doubly wrong. First, because Romanticism is much more than a literary movement, although, of course, it includes a very important literary phenomenon, literary component. And the second mistake is that Romanticism did not finish in 1830, as some historians say, nor in 1848, as other historians of literature say. I would argue that Romanticism as a worldview, as a Weltanschauung, as one of the main forms of modern culture, starting with, let's say, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 18th century, continues till today, 2008, and still has a bright future. So, what I understand by Romanticism, a cultural protest against modern capitalist civilization in the name of pre-capitalist or pre-modern values. So the romantic critique of capitalist reification, alienation, quantification, abstraction, and disenchantment of the world, that's perhaps the most important, against a protest against the disenchantment, Entzauberung der Welt, to use Max Weber's term, is premised on an idealized past, real or imaginary. But I would argue it is not necessarily regressive. One imagines, since it refers to the past, it must be past-oriented and regressive. It's not so. Of course, it can take Romanticism, these romantic protests, can take both conservative or regressive or reactionary forms and revolutionary ones. In the first case, the reactionary one is when Romanticism dreams of an impossible return to the past. And Romanticism is revolutionary when it aspires, or when it proceeds by a detour by the past towards the future. So the idealization of the past fuels the utopian aspirations for an emancipated future. And this is what I call revolutionary Romanticism, starting with Jean-Jacques Rousseau himself, of course, and continuing throughout the 19th century with William Blake, William Morris at the end of the century, and going through the 20th century, André Breton, just to give one name, etc., etc. So here we have a peculiar dialectic between past and future. The nostalgia for the lost paradise is invested, so to say, in the struggle or the aspiration or the dream for the future, the utopian future. Now, I will try to illustrate the romantic anti-capitalist moment in Jameson's cultural criticism by a few comments on Marxism and form. And let me start by quoting two phrases, one by Walter Benjamin and the other by Fredric Jameson himself. First quote: "Never in any previous civilization have the great metaphysical preoccupations, the fundamental questions of being and of the meaning of life, seemed so utterly remote and pointless." The second quote: "Our social activity has lost its metaphysical seriousness. It has become a matter of civilization like the electric light." End of the quote. Now, we could play the game of guessing. Who is the author of the first and who is the author of the second? It would be very funny, but I haven't got the time for it. We'll eat on my precious 20 minutes. So I'm going to tell you immediately the authors are Fredric Jameson for the first quote and Walter Benjamin for the second. Okay? Some of you may have guessed already. Jameson's quote comes from Marxism and Form, and Benjamin's quote from a little-known, youthful writing from 1912 called Dialogue über die Religiosität der Gegenwart, Dialogue on the Religiosity of the Present, an astonishing piece that celebrates Romanticism and dreams of a religious socialism inspired by, I quote, "the heroic revolutionary aspirations of the past." Now, since Benjamin's text was published only in 1977 in the complete writings in German, Jameson could not have known it when he wrote his own remark, right, in 1971. So it simply documents an attitude which is common to both, the romantic nostalgia for something important, here designated as metaphysics, that was lost in modern bourgeois civilization. Now, I use the term nostalgia, but isn't nostalgia of the past, for the past, inevitably linked to regressive and reactionary views? Now, we can find in Marxism and Form a comment on nostalgia that reveals in a striking way both Jameson's profound understanding of Walter Benjamin, it's a comment on Walter Benjamin, and his own sympathy for revolutionary nostalgia, which gave the title for my paper. Okay? So let me read this quote from Marxism and Form. But if nostalgia as a political motivation is most frequently associated with fascism, there is no reason why a nostalgia conscious of itself, a lucid and remorseless dissatisfaction with the present, on the grounds of some remembered plenitude, cannot furnish as adequate a revolutionary stimulus as any other. 2 points. The example of Benjamin is there to prove it. End of the quote. By the way, we have here a precise definition of Jameson's own brand of anti-capitalism. A lucid and remorseless dissatisfaction with the present state of the world. Now, in fact, the moment of nostalgia, i.e. of romantic anti-capitalism, in fact is present in most of the authors discussed in Marxism and Form. And Fredric Jameson clearly emphasized this aspect. Yeah? For instance, again, according to Fredric Jameson, in Herbert Marcuse, I quote, the primary energy of revolutionary activity derives from the memory of a prehistoric happiness. The origin of utopian thinking is related to the unconscious memory of that prehistoric paradise in the individual psyche. But this has its anthropological equivalent in, I quote, Marx and Engels' valorization of the stage of matriarchal communism in social development. Yeah, end of the quote. So this is for Herbert Marcuse. Benjamin we saw already, and now for Ernst Bloch. Well, Ernst Bloch's criticism, ferocious criticism of modern capitalist civilization and his utopia of the future cannot be separated from his nostalgia for the cathedrals of the past and their mystery. Now I quote Fredric Jameson on Ernst Bloch. It is precisely this sense of mystery or the marvelous, whether conveyed by surrealism, I underline the word surrealism, by Flemish still life or by the glorious encasement of a Renaissance Madonna, is negated by modern civilization. And according to Bloch, instead of cathedrals, the most original achievement of modern civilization in architecture is the modern bathroom and water closet. It's a famous quote from Ernst Bloch. Now, of course, one can say that Bloch is being unfair to modern architecture. There is something else than gigantic water closets. But I think it's sarcastic and devastating. Criticism is a brilliant example of this romantic anti-capitalist irony. Yeah? Now, I emphasize the word surrealism, yes, and I think it's not by accident that Jameson mentions here the surrealist movement, which celebrates the marvelous, yes, he referred to mystery and the marvelous. Well, for surrealism, the marvelous is one of its most vital concerns. Now, most, in fact, of the authors discussed in Marxism and Form shared, among other things, a passion for surrealism. Walter Benjamin published in 1929 a brilliant Marxist interpretation of surrealism. Ernst Bloch, one of the chapters of Heritage of this time, from 1935, has as a title, Thinking Surrealisms. And Herbert Marcuse, as some of you may know, entertained a sustained dialogue in the 60s and 70s with the Chicago Surrealist group. So one of the reasons they had this interest for surrealism is because, I think, surrealism is one of the most radical forms of this revolutionary romantic protest against bourgeois civilization in the 20th century. Now, of course, from the viewpoint of mainstream and conventional histories of literature, the idea of a romantic movement in the 20th century doesn't make sense. But not so Fredric Jameson, who was as much interested in 1971 in Marxism and form on surrealism as the three dialecticians he discussed. And he doesn't hesitate to associate surrealism with Romanticism. And here's also a very interesting passage in Marxism and Form. Says Fredric Jameson that the first Romanticism, the 19th century Romanticism, was essentially a reaction of defense against the, I quote, unprecedented transformation of the world into the henceforth barren and materialist environment of middle-class capitalism. Okay? But, continues Jameson, there emerged in the 20th century a new sort of Romanticism, aiming to reinvent prophetically Schiller's vision of freedom, both in the spirit and the letter, in poetry and politics alike. Which are the manifestations of this new sort of Romanticism? And here, Jameson quotes from André Breton's deuxième manifeste de surréalisme, 1930. At this hour, I'm quoting Jameson, says the spokesman for such a new Romanticism, i.e. André Breton, and here Jameson quotes Breton. Yes, I'm quoting Jameson, quoting Breton. The authorities in France are making grotesque preparations to celebrate the centenary of Romanticism, 1930. And we hereby declare that we are willing to pass for the historical tail end of Romanticism. Means Romanticism goes on, and we, the surrealists, are its historical tail end. But we are a prehensile tail, like the monkeys. And in fact, he goes on, Breton, saying that what has wrongly been called the heroic period of Romanticism is just the beginning. Just the beginning. And now, really, with the surrealist movement, is that Romanticism is being developed through its prehensile tail. So I would argue that what we have here between Fredric Jameson, Herbert Marcuse, Walter Benjamin, and Ernst Bloch, and the surrealists, is nothing less than a constellation, a cultural and political constellation, whose light is the nocturnal one of romantic anti-capitalism. Okay. But now I come to my second and last part, which is shorter. As I said above, negation and romanticism are only moments in Jameson's dialectical confrontation with capitalism. Because for Marxism, capitalism cannot just be negated, but must be superseded, aufgehoben, yes, in the Hegelian and Marxist dialectical meaning. So let us return for a moment to that quote from the postmodernism article from 1984 in New Left Review, which I mentioned at the beginning. But let's have the whole paragraph. I quote now Fredric Jameson. In a well-known passage from the Communist Manifesto, Marx powerfully urges us to do the impossible, namely to think this development of capitalism positively and negatively all at once, to achieve, in other words, a type of thinking, good. Mehr Licht, said Goethe, but it didn't help. Difficult to quote in the dark, but to achieve, in other words, a type of thinking that would be capable of grasping the demonstrably baleful features of capitalism, along with the extraordinary and liberating dynamism simultaneously, within a single thought and without attenuating any of the force of either judgments. We are somehow to lift our minds to a point in which it is possible to understand that capitalism is at the same time the best thing that has ever happened to the human race and the worst. Okay? I think this is a very important statement, and I think it summarizes better than any other I know this dialectic of progress in Marxist thought. Now, a few pages later in the same, thank you, so Goethe's hope was realized. A few pages later, Jameson draws a very important political conclusion from this general dialectical approach. And he says that confronted with the world dimension of capital in their own times, Marx and Lenin did not conceive socialism as a return to small organizations or to nationalism. That's a dead alley. Huh? How much the more, now I'm quoting Jameson, is this not the case with the even more global and totalizing space of the New World System, which demands the invention and elaboration of an internationalism of a radically new type. End of the quote, 1984. Now I would add that this very significant political statement is even more relevant today, 25 years later, when capitalist globalization rules the planet, raising the urgent need of globalizing resistance. Well, I would argue, and I'm concluding with this, that this is precisely the aim of the anti-capitalist activists who make up the hard core of the global justice movement. And perhaps Fredric Jameson agrees with me, since I had the pleasure to share a workshop with him at the World Social Forum in Porto Alegre, which mentioned by Maria Elisa in 2003. Now, sure enough, this movement of movements, the global justice movement, it's still small and fragile, but it is probably the strategic place where the spicy internationalist culture of the 21st century, of a radically new type, as Fredric Jameson said, is being cooked. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Löwy, for a, if I may say so, lucid and illuminating talk. Thank you very, very much.